moderator today is going to be Bakari Katwana. Bakari is a journalist, activist, and political analyst whose commentary on politics and youth culture have been seen on CNN, Fox News, C-SPAN, PBS, and has been heard on NPR. He is the CEO of Rap Sessions and Senior Media Fellow at the Harvard Law think tank. The Jamestown Project is a 2002 book, The Hip Hop Generation, Young Blacks, and the Crisis in African American Culture, has been the former executive director of this course. Mr. Katwana has taught in the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago and is the co-founder of the 2004 National Hip Hop Political Convention and is a visiting scholar. This Institute for the Study of Women and Gender in the Arts and Media at Columbia College of Chicago. So I welcome Mr. Bakari Katwana.
How you guys doing today? Hi. All right. We are going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to jump into a conversation we're going to have for 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open up the floor for your participation. That's all right? All right. With our theme is From Precious to Colored Girls, the Black Image in the American Mind. And what we're hoping to do is to look at the ways in which race is being discussed and debated in our society today, primarily within mainstream media, politics, pop culture. What does it mean? How are things changing? Where are we going? Just kind of jump into the whole territory. So I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. We started out doing this about 5 years ago, and we've taken on a different thing every year. So this is, I think actually, this is the sixth tour that we're in right now. We were at Syracuse University last week, or I think it was 2 weeks ago. And so we're here, and we're going to a number of other places around the country, about 10 to 15 cities over the course of 2011. So, on the very end is Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. You guys have your programs. I think all the bios are in there, so I'll give you an abbreviated version so we don't consume so much time. But Dr. Neal is a professor of Black popular culture at the university. He has written 4 books with another one on the way. The new book is called Looking for Leroy, or In Search of Leroy. Looking for Leroy. He's the author of New Black Man and several other books. He hosts a television program on the internet, TV. I don't know what we call it now, right? What do you call it? Web TV. Called Left of Black, and it airs every Monday. He also has been writing a lot on Loop21.com, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mark recently did a thing on, was it CNN that you did the thing on? It was a conversation about the removal of the N-word from Huckleberry Finn. Next to Mark is Joan Morgan, who is a journalist and author, and now, again, PhD student at NYU in American Studies. She's also recently been named, let me see if I can get it right, one of the new faces of Black history by KISS FM in New York. And she's the author of a very important book called When Chicken Has Come Home to Roost, which if you haven't read it, you should read. It's one of the first books, if not, I would say probably the first book that began to look at gender as it intersected with hip hop in a serious way that began to force us to think about the ways in which we should be thinking in more complicated ways about gender. So you should check that out, and I'm sure she's going to talk about that some today and other things. Next to Joan is Dr. John Jennings, who was a visual arts professor at the University of Illinois. Actually, he's a graphic studies professor at the University of Illinois. He's moving to SUNY Buffalo, where he's going to be a visual arts professor. He's written several books. One, he co-authored with Damian Duffy. The book is called Black Comic. It's a history of independent Black comics. He also authored a graphic novel called The Hole, which I'm reading right now. It's hilarious and bizarre at the same time. And he's doing some really amazing things with images and a lot of things about visual interpretation, and has taught me in the time that I've known him that I don't know as much about images as I thought I did. And last but not least is journalist Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, who has a master's in journalism from Columbia. And she also has written extensively for the Washington Post, Village Voice, Vibe Magazine, where she's been an editor, and what else? The Nation, where she wrote a provocative piece called The Obama Generation Revisited. She's also written a piece for Vibe that has been well circulated on the internet called Love Hurts, about violence, gender violence in hip hop. And more recently, she's written a commentary on street harassment that was published in Spanish. And the title she's going to have to tell us about.
The public LDR?
It was
In
published in
LDR. What was the
and
title of
it's
the piece?
called The Uncomfortable Walk.
No, in Spanish though.
That goes okay to do
Yes.
that.
And the piece inspired city council hearings in New York around the question of street harassment. So that's the panel. Lots of interesting perspectives and lots of years of work here. We're going to go in pretty deep. We've been already having a conversation amongst ourselves. Man, we just finished watching the SNL Blackenstein, Robert Blackenstein. I don't even know if we're ready for that yet. I'm going to start with Elizabeth Mendez-Berry. You can talk to us about your work as a journalist, and as you think about the topic of images and representation and how they evolve. Really, kind of, I think we've seen escalation since the election of Obama, with really the backlash against having a Black president. Can you talk about your reaction to the topic as it intersects with journalism?
Well, so when we talk about images, one place we get a lot of our images is the media, right? We get them from the daily news, we get them from TV news, advertising, all those things. And the area that I work in is journalism and the way that people are represented in that context. And something I look at a lot is who's making the decisions, who's calling the shots, who decides how things get covered, right? And how things get portrayed. Do we decide to look at, for example, crime in one community in the same way as we look at crime in another community? I think one of the really interesting challenges that has emerged in the context of Obama's election is this idea that we're post-racial, right? And so everything's fine, and everything's been solved, and there really no need to even have this conversation anymore. And there is that perception from a lot of people in a lot of sectors. And I think, a lot of the more simplistic media really got on the bandwagon after that election. I think the danger there lies in that we live in a society where there are a lot of very, very serious racial disparities and racial problems in terms of the way things are portrayed and the policies that we exist within. But we're not acknowledging it as much. Something significant, I don't know, did any of you read the newspaper, Hands in the Air newspaper ever? Do you read it online? Right. So one of the big things that shifted is that people aren't buying the newspaper as much as they used to. So the news industry is dealing with a lot of challenges, a lack of funding, a lack of advertising revenue. The impact that has had is a lot of layoffs. And imagine who in the newsroom gets laid off first. It's usually the people of color. And so what's happened is that even as we have this alleged post-racial movement with Obama's election, we actually have less diversity in the newsrooms of this country. The impact that has on the type of coverage that you're seeing in your local newspaper or on your local TV news is pretty significant in my opinion. there's almost this sense that we don't need to worry anymore. And at the same time, it's a very worrying trend in the news media, and I think in a lot of different sectors, where the most vulnerable people in the newsroom are the first people to lose their jobs. And ultimately, that's meant that currently we have maybe 10% people of color in newsrooms around the country, despite the fact that we're 30% of the country.
It was a study that NAJ put out recently that talked about an even further decline of representation of cross-race in the media, particularly at the management level. I thought that was interesting. When we saw the rise of the Tea Party, it seemed to be more of these kind of oppositional racial politics that were very central. Do you see that having an impact on the images that we see in media? And you were commenting earlier today on the whiteout of the Oscars.
So the Tea Party, I think, is really interesting because the Tea Party is an example of what happens when a political movement has a news organization that exists to support and, facilitate it, which is Fox News, right? I don't know if you all know this, but Fox News has a very, very close relationship with the Tea Party. Fox News will let people know, where to be for the protest. It operated almost like a spokesperson in a PR role for the Tea Party. That's unique, right? No other political party has that specific relationship with the news media. So that was huge, and I think that was really impactful. As far as what happened with the Oscars, I think, at least what I can say about the news media is that if you don't see people of color doing beat reporting, which is what I'm also looking at, you're definitely not seeing them in positions of power, making decisions about how stories get told. So for me, the biggest concern when I think about representation isn't that it has to necessarily be a Salvadoran person covering a Salvadoran community, let's say, right? It's not necessarily that. But that you want to have some diversity in the editorial meetings that decide how those Salvadoran people get portrayed. And if you don't have a Latino in the room who can maybe do some translating, who can do some explaining about the cultural factors that are going on, the chances that you're going to get good coverage are a lot slimmer. Does that make sense? And so that is something that we look at, and when we look at the whole Oscar situation, why were there no people of color who were selected? Why were there no films, featuring people of color that were selected to be celebrated last Sunday? Maybe part of it has to do with the fact that there are a real lack of people at the level of decision making who can support those films and backgrounds. So on the one hand, it's important to look at who's in front of the camera, but it's also really important to find out who's behind the scenes.
I think it's important the way you kind of help start us out here, because I think one of the things that happened when we had this conversation before, we didn't really draw the lines clearly between the artistic production and the analysis of what's going on in media. I think we also didn't draw the lines clearly between like the art of some of the films that we were talking about and the film adaptation of the original literary pieces. And then, Joan, I remember you pointed out that we kind of collapsed a couple of films that maybe that were like completely two different things. But before we go into the art side of the conversation, I want to talk a little bit more about race and representation and what we're seeing. How has it changed? I know that in your piece you did on in the book that Tracy Sharpley Whiting wrote about Obama and the speech, you talked about the ways in which race, when you talk about blackness in America, a lot of times it's kind of narrowed down to the African American experience. So I'm curious if you could talk some about that. But then from there, I want to go into some of the things you did in Chicken Heads, specifically related to color workers. So I know you had a quote you said you were going to read to us today, or is it in your memory?
Hi, everybody. The part is a very loaded three-part question.
I think you can handle it.
Let me start with, when we talk about representation of folks of color, particularly Black Latinos, in the media. I guess the part of it where I enter into the discourse is acknowledging what Elizabeth is talking about, but I also look at what our expectations are as people of color about how we're represented. And so I think that we still function tying our creative folk to a certain kind of way that we expect to be represented in the media. So we ask, not is it a good film or is it a bad film, but were the images positive or were the images negative? Not did I enjoy it, but what is it doing to uplift us as a people? Which I think is a very difficult position for people who create art and film, because it keeps us tied to a set of expectations that really don't have anything to do with being creative. They have to do with representation politics and upward politics. And so in the question of like, why were the Oscars so white, it's really hard for me as an artist and a writer to also say, well, what films were supposed to be recognized? What actually quality Black films did we have this year that were Oscar contenders, where we're actually saying so-and-so should have been up for a nomination and was completely overlooked? And is it really that important to me that they're Black actors handing out Oscars? Like, I don't really care who hands out the Oscars. It's not like my point of focus when I'm watching the show. And so the quote that what I really wanted to talk about a little bit today, I'm in grad school. So I'm reading about this guy, Stuart Hall, who's a British, Black Jamaican British cultural theorist. And Hall talks a lot about what's called the Black essential subject, which is that there's a way that we construct Black characters in Black art that says, this is the representative good Black person, and this is the work that that subject is supposed to do. And when all of us watch it, we're supposed to have the same feelings about it, we're supposed to have the same emotions about it, and it doesn't matter where you're from. What Bakari was talking about before in this piece that I did for another book, I'm Jamaican. I'm Jamaican, born in Jamaica, raised in America. I identify myself as Black Caribbean American.
Yeah.
I have no African American roots or lineage at all. And when I say African American, I'm speaking specifically about native-born Black Americans who are the descendants of Southern slaves. Yet, when my experiences is cast back by me by white media and Black media, it's assumed that my experience is straight African American, although that has nothing to do with my historical or cultural context. And so when we talk about the Oscars and what white decisions white people are making, I'm like, yeah, well, my problem is even more baseline than that, because the people who create our art and hold it to certain representation politics completely overlook that I have a different experience, which is fine, but just don't conflate it all as the African American experience. African American and Black American are not interchangeable terms. So Hall describes that as using an essential Black subject. So I wanted to start us out with this. It is true that as the struggle moves forward and assumes new forms, it does to some degree displace, reorganize, and reposition the different cultural strategies in relation to one another. It marks what I can only call the end of innocence, or the end of an innocent notion of the essential Black subject. Here again, the end of the essential Black subject is something which people are increasingly debating, but they may not have fully reckoned with its political consequences. And here Hall talks about what is at stake when we give up representation politics. What is at stake when we create art that does not adhere to, it has to be a positive image. It has to be representative of an overall African-American experience in a particular way in order to be considered good. And he says, what is at issue here is the recognition of the extraordinary diversity of subjective positions, social experiences, and cultural identities which compose the category Black. That is the recognition that Black is not essentially a politically and culturally constructed category, and it can cannot be grounded in a fixed set of transcultural or transcendental racial categories and has no guarantees in nature. What this brings into play is the recognition of the immense diversity and differentiation of the historical and cultural experience of Black subjects. This inevitably entails a weakening or fading of the notion that race, or some composite notion of race, around the term Black will either guarantee the effectivity of any cultural practice or determine in any way its final sense of aesthetic value. We should put this as plainly as possible, Paul says. Films are not necessarily good because Black people make them. So when we're talking about Precious, from Precious to Colored Girls, we haven't even opened up the possibility that as two different Black people, it's okay for us to have markedly different responses to that film. And yet the whole way that the cultural criticism, particularly over the internet and social networking, was constructed as if there was an appropriate response by virtue of melanin to what these particular films were.
This is taking us into a lot of territory. Mark, what was the term that Michael Eric Dyson used to describe Black folk who felt they had the right to define? Was it the Afro-stocracy or something? Yeah. Yes, I mean, that's what I was thinking about when you were saying that. You bring a lot of questions to mind. I think that for this generation of young people, have you guys seen the play for Colored Girls? I mean, the movie, I'm sorry, do you know the play? Have you read the play? I'm sorry, my two questions kind of came at once. You've seen the film?
We're sorry.
Hands in the air.
We're really so sorry.
Do you know, have you seen the play performed, or have you read it?
I just have a comment. When I saw the movie, I wanted to see it out of the play.
Right.
Okay.
I felt like it would have been better to pick it up.
Us too.
Yes.
Yeah. I felt like there was way too much going on in the movie. Like,
What about Precious? Have you guys seen that?
yeah.
Did you read the novel, Coach?
I read the novel before I saw it.
Okay, this is interesting. So now I want to go back to Joan again, and when Chicken has in the book, when Chicken has come home, what you talk about for Colored Girls? You remember? And you talk about your reaction to it, how important it was to you. And I think one of the things that we missed in our last conversation was we didn't talk about the play and the importance that it had to Black women. And I think you kind of captured that. Can you talk about that? If either how you felt then or how you feel now in terms of the importance of the play first, and then we'll go into the film.
I had this moment when I was about 12 years old, and I was in the community center in the South Bronx, which was where I grew up. And there was this huge poster of this woman. It was like in all these bright kind of Crayola colors, and it was graffiti written on the wall, and it said, "For colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow was enough." And I just was like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds grown, and I want to be like in it, right? So my mother had tickets to the play, and she took my very conservative Jamaican parents. My mother took my father, and I threw as much of a temper tantrum as a young Jamaican girl can throw, which is really not that much. But I threw as much as I could. I mean, I might have slammed the door and was saying, "Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier." I mean, I really acted out because my mother would not take me. And so I waited up and I wanted to hear what it is that they thought. And my mother came in and talked about how wonderful it was, and my father just went, And it was very clear to me that like Black women and Black men had a radically different conception of that film. And so I had to wait to be old enough to like experience it. And then maybe like a few years later, when I was 13 or 14, I found a copy of the book and the album and listened to it myself. And all I wanted to then be was old enough to act in the play. And then since then, like, you know, then I got roles in the play and I
What
directed.
role did you want to play?
I wanted to play the woman in orange. Because I wanted to be a deliberate coquette. Like, I was like, whatever that is, I want to be that. I want to walk down the street, you know, like Sachita, and just captivate. And for me, for Colored Girls, for all of its pain, because there's some very painful stories in For Colored Girls, it's told through, also you should know in the play there are no men. There are no men in the play. There's no set. There's really just an empty, dark set, and these women in different colors. And it's really about the power of the words. And the men, you know, the play talks about men, but men are not front and center as actors in the play. And what that really taught me as a writer was the importance and the power of the woman's voice. And the importance about that language in and of itself, even without a visual, is an extremely powerful medium. And it taught me that there's a place, an important place, in Black American narrative for women's stories. And it also taught me that even with the most painful stories, that Black women can still be sexy, we can still laugh, we can still have joy and stories, and above all else, we can still have meaningful and lasting friendships. And when I sat and watched Tyler Perry's version, when I saw this work that is like the hallmark of Black female literary, in the Black female literary canon in America, lifted and taken out of the hands of a Black woman, you know, Black female director, and lifted and put in Tyler Perry's hands, it was, one student described it as Syracuse as she couldn't believe the violence, the utter violence done to the script. Because his conception as a director that's not particularly, doesn't do well with nuance, let me put it that way, just could not begin to conceive of what that original material was about. And so it also becomes, for me, again, what Elizabeth is telling is when we have stories, who tells our stories? And is the fact that he was Black enough? I would have rather had it in like a talented white girl's hands for because at least then there might have been some conception of what it meant to be a woman.
Right.
And to enjoy yourself.
I want to go back a little bit and kind of stay in the same territory to some of the things that you said. I think this conversation is really interesting to have with you. Because I think that you have a very sophisticated way in which you dissect the pieces. So like, you see the value of the story over the value of the ways that people are reacting to this, to what they consider to be stereotypical images. So you see the power of the telling of the story, and both in the case I think of Precious, and in the case of Colored Girls, the play, not the film, but the power of people being able to tell their story. Now I want to go back to something else. I was at a panel where Spike Lee was. And
Wait, but before you say that, I need to say why.
Okay.
It's because I always sit outside of the frame. It's because my position as a cultural critic is always outside the frame. I don't have the luxury of sitting inside the African American frame, because that's not my experience. I also don't have the luxury of sitting in a purely Jamaican frame, because I didn't grow up on the island. So even when I go home, people will acknowledge me as Jamaican, but they understand that I'm not Jamaican in the same way, and let me know that I'm not Jamaican in the same way that they're Jamaican. So I don't. Yes, I'm a Jamaican. So I don't have a country in the same way that people who see this strictly through the lens of representation politics have a country. So I speak from a certain place of homelessness that allows me to speak outside the frame and take the position.
It's good. I mean, I think that you kind of answered the next question. You can respond to this, or we can give it to John. Okay. A couple of things. One, I remember recently being at a panel where Spike Lee spoke, and it was a panel organized around the question of how do you reimagine the ways in which Black men have been presented in American media. And one of the things that he said was, when we're talking about the film industry, he said, we're not at the table deciding what gets made. So I wonder how that, I remember one of the, when you were talking, it made me think about who decides what gets made, what gets made, and it also made me think about what then do we do with the underlying stereotypes that are present, even when that may not be the goal, but the stereotypes are so, it's such a currency of them in American culture that they're present. So like, what then do we do with the stereotypes?
I think that's really about your negotiation with whiteness and white gaze and how important it is to you. Do you sit and do you watch the film as an individual person, an individual black person, an individual Latino person watching a piece of film or reading a piece of work? Or are you constantly engaging it with like, what do white people think when they see this? I personally don't really give a rat's about what white people see when they are watching depictions of me. I'm interested in how I'm engaging with what that particular artist wanted to say in their work. It's one of the reasons I can sit through something as difficult as Precious and understand the value in that. So I think that there in that, even though you're not putting that in your question, implicit in it is the negotiation of whiteness and where you put the white gaze and how you privilege the white gaze in what you call stereotypes. Precious to me is not a film about stereotypes. It's a lot of people Mark and I grew up with. And so like your ability to experience it as, not your ability, but the ability to experience it solely as stereotypes also speaks very strongly to me about what people's class background is. Because as someone who grew up in a working class, impoverished neighborhood, in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, while it was burning, not the gentrified South Bronx now, but while it was burning, those characters are part of my day-to-day reality. The darkness of her hallways, how unsafe she felt from physical violence is part of my childhood day-to-day reality. So when other people are negotiating white gazes and see stereotypes, I see something that's very resonant with how I grew up.
See, and I kind of feel like I'm valuing both of those. And the same way, not so much navigating or negotiating whiteness, but I think here I want to share a quote from, or a paraphrase of a political scientist, Martin Gillens. And this is something that Kathy Cohen quotes, representing her book, Democracy Agreements. The article that she's referencing is called Race and Poverty in America, Public Misconceptions and the American News Media, the Journal of the Public Opinion Quarterly. And so basically, she says that his work focuses on media distortions and racial representations of the poor, and that Martin Gillens argues that mass media is a critical information source for most Americans, and that media distortions and social conditions result in public misconceptions that reinforce the natural inherent biases and stereotypes. Now, the interesting thing about this to me is in John's work, I think he talks about people coming to the table with the stereotypes and the biases already in them. And so that the stereotypes become what you're imposing, which I guess the white gaze you're talking about, what you're imposing, I guess, based upon your experiences. So I want to get John, and I don't want to react to that, but I want to get John to kind of, if you can kind of weigh in on how you're viewing this from your standpoint in the ways in which we're kind of navigating two things, really. We're talking about the stereotypes in the work, and then how do you separate from the work itself? Can you even do that?
I don't think you can, but I think it's really difficult because, as far as like the way literacy is taught, it's still a very text-based, I think, literary education. I was thinking about some of the things that don't talk about, for example, centralization, and also, oh, sorry, can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. Hello, anyway. All right, so I was thinking about as an artist, and I recently had this conversation with my students. I teach studio art, I teach illustration, things that I work with graphic images. And so a lot of times, trying to describe myself as an artist, it just happens to be black. A lot of times that blackness comes start to, because obviously the African American, right, or something other, right? So anyway, personal thought. And so I'm always negotiating those issues around like, what am I representing? I'm originally from Mississippi, so my mother was like, oh, you know, I'm going to make nice images of people in cotton fields and stuff like that. I was like, no. I'm very interested in this symbol like those particular types of stereotypes. And I work in comics and graphic novels because, for one, they are intersectional in the nature of how they describe narrative because they're text and image, and it's kind of like a multimodal kind of discourse, just inherently the medium of comics, right? And so, also this idea of centralization is really like it's a really strong argument as far as like just how we see things, because we're always talking about that kind of like diametrically opposed argument about this and that, male, female, white, black, you know, gay, straight, whatever. And honestly, like the issues around identity are much more complex, you know. But the nature of images are like disrupting reality, really. But they don't necessarily depict reality. They actually they attempt to like describe different types of realities, and they're imaginary. You know, they're imaginary. For instance, if I took like a picture of say anybody's mom, right, your mother, person who fed you cream of wheat, or you know, raised you, whatever, and I just ripped it to shreds, would that upset you? It would, right? I wasn't harming your mother, but I was harming the image, right? So it's this idea of how these people images are so powerful to represent these types of like truths, right? It's a different type of truth. This idea of stereotype is really interesting because it comes from the training profession. So around 1794 or so, this gentleman named Firmin Didot was a French, from a long line of French printers, in this process that was actually able to like quicken and replicate images in print medium. The idea of the stereotype that we're talking about now doesn't really like 1920s, 1922, Walter Lippmann talks about this idea of the image as kind of a mapping system for the complexities of society, the world complexity of society. The thing about stereotype, it comes from the word stereos, the Greek, which means hard or fixed, hard or fixed. So this idea of the stereotype is not supposed to shift, it's not supposed to change. It is meant to essentialize, right? It's the function of the stereotype is to essentialize it. It does it very well. It's a very well-designed thing because it strips away the complexity of our everyday existence, and it's easy to push this form instead of content, right? Because inside I see content, outside I see form. It's the same way for us like hip-hop is a culture, but it's a form, that kind of thing. Something about hip-hop, about the stereotype is that if you think about chattel slavery in America, the enslaved black body was never seen as a whole body. It was always chopped up into pieces that were needed by the woman. So if you needed a black woman for sex, it was just, you know, if you needed a back to like carry a bale of cotton, it was just a back. So you're never seen as a whole person, you're seen as like these little pieces. So a lot of stuff that I do in my work, I try to like disrupt that idea of broken up body, you know, just disruption. As far as like this idea of how black women are seen in media, you know, it's a very important aspect of the stereotype. Because as far as like how black women are treated traditionally in media and just in our country, African American women, they've been kind of subjected to these ideas of disruption to the point of almost invisibility. And so when you see pieces like Shanghai's work, Sapphire's work, they're extremely potent because of this idea of taking that shape of absence and giving it form, you know. And so when you have people like I would say it was kind of a form of artistic transvestism, where it's actually like usurping this idea of you know, of the black female voice. Something I wanted to think of too.
You okay? Yeah.
I made some notes on the plane, so I become scripted. And it's captain. Okay, anyway. All right. You know what? Actually, that's a bit over. I realized that I can't anyway. Okay, so this idea of the shape of absence. I was looking at just the films themselves. It's just like the connection between those particular types of images. I study images quite a bit. And you're right, Tyler Perry as an artiste, you know, very heavy-handed. The thing that carries that film for is just the performance of those the women in those films are Despite the record, exactly. Just amazingly powerful performances, you know. I was thinking about this idea of how Ntozake Shange and Sapphire both kind of reappropriate this idea of disruption, because what they do is actually take this idea of disruption and they make it a positive thing. Because a rainbow is like this broken light. And they take a white light and contract it and make it into like these myriad tails, right? And you look at like Sapphire, who actually takes her experiences in the school system and create basically it's very similar, I think, to like the close of slavery time when we make these mapping systems. Precious is a map. She's like a cloak. You know, she's like just walking around with different types of experiences and how to put it together. You know? I think it's really interesting as far as like how these particular color schemes play out. And something I noticed, I didn't notice the first time I saw the film, but then you say you saw the film, right? Did you notice when you think poster Joan about the poster?
It's a copy of the poster on the door up there for this event that is a reference.
Right. Right. Because that's the picture. There's actually a picture of it, and she's awesome, right? There's a poster of the play in the movie Precious, like right above the couch, in the household of Miss Redding, you know. And I think that's a really interesting connection between them, as far as like someone placed it there. Lee Daniels doesn't talk about it in the commentary for the film, but I thought it was a really interesting coincidence that, to me, it seems like Precious is like, she is the woman who's there. She is the woman that finds God within herself, you know. And that's kind of translated by Susan Taylor's giving her the scarf, you know, this kind of symbolic communication. And so I think what's really interesting about these films and about just these expressions, and I think a lot of us are trying to find are these beautiful spaces. Joan talks about it with great space, great area. I think that Mark, the great space. I mean, it's just an outside space, a little space of creation that is kind of trying to circumvent this stereotype.
I want to ask you something else, but I think.
I just want to hop in real quick because I think in this conversation about stereotyping, to me, a really big important distinction is, has anybody seen Movie Scarface? Any fans here? So I personally, from a Latina perspective, I have some issues with Tony Montana, right? I think a lot of people have issues with Tony Montana. For me, a big part of it is just the accent, which is probably the worst Cuban accent I've ever heard in my entire life, right? Are there Cubans who deal drugs? There are Cubans who deal drugs, right? Are there Latinos who participate in the drug trade? Yeah. Do we not want to see that represented? Sometimes it makes us uncomfortable, right? But we need to see it represented because it's part of our truth. But I think for me, the big distinction, and this is something that everybody has been getting at, is to tell a story that's true. And so, to me, I don't know if anybody in here, I'm coming from a Colombian perspective, Maria Full of Grace, has anybody seen that movie? What did you think of it?
I thought it was really raw, like the story to tell, like just what the girls go through, just to, in a sense, like they try to better their lives, but the things that they have to do, in essence, just get away.
So it's about a young woman in Colombia who winds up working as a drug dealer. So she swallows something like a ton of cocaine and condoms, and she has to carry them on the plane. And she comes to New York, and her story, I mean, it's not the glamorous drug dealing story. It's not the gold-plated saints story. It's the real life, I might get killed because one of these things is going to rupture my stomach story, right? It's not a flattering, uplifting story about Colombians, but it's a real story. And so the art is compelling, and the truth of it is compelling. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of move towards, is something where you see that intersection between truth and art, you know? So that's why I just wanted to bring that out a little bit, because I know that when we talk about representation, particularly for Colombians who never get depicted in a way that is not as a drug dealer, right? Let's be honest. I mean, when was the last time you saw a Colombian in any film, in any context, who wasn't talking about a Colombian necktie, right? I mean, it's true. But then, okay, I also have to be honest about the fact that that is a significant export from my native land, right? In addition to coffee and also plastic bread. So how do we create space to have an honest conversation about those experiences? Because they are about that external gaze, as Joan was saying, but worry about being true to our own stories and being willing to be honest.
It's not common. This is actually, I'm really embarrassed about this slippage. But I'm hoping that Mark can actually address this a little bit, because I feel that we're slipping between these, in this discussion of stereotypes. We're talking about the stereotypes in mass media about that are portrayed and repeated and sort of reified stereotypes of people of color. And then we're discussing in the very similar way that's kind of disturbing to me, the accusation of Black and Latino filmmakers portraying stereotypes of themselves in their own work. And so I think it's really important to deconflate, Mark. What is the difference? And when is it a stereotype in the hands of Black artists?
Should I add one question to it? Should I let you take that?
Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, one of the things I was going to ask you was about Tyler Perry himself. And kind of going back to the Spike Lee kind of commentary of who decides what gets made. But also kind of looking at his role as helping to finance Precious, but also his role in directing, and I remember some of the comments you made last time about him working out some of his own, what do you see going on there?
Well, let me respond first to Jones.
Okay.
I think we've been, as Black communities, we've been far more willing to give Black artists latitude to represent more problematic images of our experiences. Part of that has been about this desire for visibility. Because there's been such a lack of visibility of Black images and Black bodies, positive or negative. Folks tend to be very excited when we come into the frame, regardless of what those images look like. So the fact that we can watch Starsky and Hutch, a television show as opposed to a movie, the fact that we can watch Starsky and Hutch in 1977 and get to see Antonio Fargas every week as Huggy Bear. Yes, Huggy Bear is a problematic image, but yet he's the only image. Right. Huggy Bear plays a pimp in the original Starsky and Hutch series. And I think very often when those things, Snoop plays, right, in the Owen Wilson film.
In a completely different way.
Yeah. Right. I mean, by that time, he's character.
Right.
And Raging Huggy Bear wasn't.
Right.
But what happens in this context, I think when white artists are depicting us that way, we're far more sensitive to those images, right, and much more critical. And I think that's where Liz's point, really rings true. Is the story just true, right? Is the story right? And if the story is right, it doesn't matter what the artist is, if it speaks to the truth of our experiences, whether it's white or Black. And we have to be comfortable enough, given the realities of what Hollywood looks like. And when you talk about, who makes a decision to make movies, it's not really a question of who makes a decision to make movies, it's who makes a decision to pay for those movies.
Yes.
Right, particularly at a moment where anyone can get access to a digital camera, anybody can make a movie at this moment. But if your goal is to make a movie and put it in 3,000 theaters, and get it to DVD and have it on HBO and all those kind of things, somebody has to pay for that, and most Black and Latino artists don't have that capacity on their own. And so that's a part, that's a piece of what we're talking about. In terms of the Tyler Perry thing, and I have really complex feelings about Tyler Perry and his products. And part of it is the truth of the reality. When folks think about Black film, your generation of folks, the names you immediately think about are folks like Spike Lee and John Singleton, right? If we want to push back and go further, we can think about people like Oscar Micheaux in the 1930s, right? We can think about people like Halle Jarima, who's done it brilliantly on an independent level. We can think about a woman like Julie Dash, who does a groundbreaking film called Daughters of the Dust. And what has she done since then? Right, I mean, and so Tyler Perry steps into the fray. And, you know, when folks hear this, it's a little uncomfortable, but you know, Tyler Perry is the most successful commercial, the most successful black director of all time. And folks don't quite know what to do with that, right? You know, Spike Lee, who has a body of work, right, that, you know, no matter how you feel about Spike Lee on a critical level, right, he's a significant filmmaker in terms of his skill set. The Spike Lee film that has made the most money, and anybody want to venture a guess on what Spike Lee film has made the most money in movie theaters? He didn't make White Man Can't Jump. No, I'm pretty sure that film made more money than any Spike Lee film. What, he didn't make Boys in the Right Thing.
How about this right there?
Do the Right Thing, right? His best-selling film is Inside Man.
Oh, yeah.
Which
Did he make that?
yes, he directed it. Which, and the critical point of this, it's the only film that Spike Lee made that you really can't define as a black film. It made $88 million. One of his follow-up films in Inside Man was Miracle at St. Anne. Cost $48 million to make. Anybody want to guess how much money that film made? It made about $9 million. So you're talking about a 300 or 400% loss, right? When you make a film using that strategy, you don't make another film, right? Which is why there has not been another Spike Lee theatrical release since Miracle at St. Anne. So Tyler Perry steps into the film and creates a model where he spends $3 to $5 million to make a film. And the film makes 10 times that. All right. So, with the exception of John Singleton's Fast and Furious, all right, which made about $115 million, right? That's the most successful economically the most successful film by a black director. It's not a black film. If we talk about a black director in a black film, it's Madea Goes to Jail, which made about right, which made about $92 million, right? So we put Tyler Perry in this kind of context, right? He has understood the model that if you spend $5 or $6 million, right, and with the dearth of opportunities for black actors and actresses, right? Look at the list of black actors who have shown up in Tyler Perry films, right? They're really all A-listers, right? And part of that is because they can't get a job in mainstream Hollywood, right? And so they end up making these Tyler Perry films, right? And so he created this model. He's spending $5, $6 million, right? And generally, on the average, makes films into $55, $60 million, right? And it's interesting because part of the backstory about this year's Hollywood thing is that you take a film like Black Swan, which was made for a budget of about $13 million, right? And it replicates that same model, right? Where it made 5 or 6 times the amount that was spent on it. And so what you see here is that there actually is a formula for black directors to be successful, but there's not necessarily a willingness for black directors to tell these kind of specific, even period piece stories, right? So we get Tyler Perry, who becomes the dominant expression, right, of what black film is like. So we take that into account. I'm one of the folks who doesn't necessarily find Madea all that problematic, right? In the sense that I know her. Let me just say I know him, because I think that goes both ways, right? The audience that Tyler Perry is pitching these movies to, I know those folks very well, right? And so there's almost something authentic about what he does in that particular genre, right? And let's be clear, he knows he's not Spike Lee. And when you go to see an Madea film, you're not expecting to see Do the Right Thing of Malcolm X, right? You're expecting to sit there for 90 minutes to laugh at ridiculous humor, right? That in the end is connected to some sort of notion of black Christian morality, right? And that's his form, right? And it's what essentially has made him a star. When Tyler Perry gets problematic, right, and what you get it for Colored Girls is Tyler Perry executive producing with Oprah Winfrey, Lee Daniels is Precious. Lee Daniels is a very different kind of filmmaker, right? Better filmmaker, no question about it, right? But he's also an art house film director, right? He's not a director, and let me just say this as explicitly as I can. Lee Daniels doesn't make movies for everyday Negroes. But of course, with a film like Precious, Oprah and Tyler Perry had to co-sign on as executive directors to bring the kind of audience to that film that normally would not come to a Lee Daniels film. And I will argue that I think, Tyler Perry got a little jealous. And For Colored Girls was supposed to be his Precious movie, right? You read Essence magazine and it's all this chatter about, is this going to be Tyler Perry's move towards an Oscar, right? Is the film going to get nominated? To push them in the direction to think about how complicated Black identity is, right? I think instructive to the Tyler Perry moment is watching the stuff that's going down with, say, Bishop Eddie Long in Atlanta.
Is anybody watching?
Everybody familiar, Bishop Eddie Long was one of the most visible Black mega features in this country, along with Creflo Dollar. I just love that name. I mean, at some level, I love Creflo because he just honors me. Creflo Dollar, give me your money, right? And then, of course, T.D. Jakes, who I think is a more complicated figure in this regard, right? But, of course, Eddie Long, sends these pictures of himself in a bodysuit, to these young boys who are part of this group that he's leading called the Longfellows, right? All this kind of weird play with language, right? And so some of these young men accuse him of sexually abusing them, right? And there is no space in contemporary Black Christian rhetoric to talk about same-sex desire, right? So, which is why even though Tyler Perry's brand is a Black man dressed as a woman, there's an absolute silence about sexuality, right, and homosexuality within the context. Though it clearly is like right there, right, in the context of the film. And I think it'd be interesting to see going down the road whether or not Tyler Perry having to wrestle with the color and that language, right, and the power of Black feminist thought, eventually will have the kind of transformative impact on him that down the road he can begin to tell the kind of stories. And this is the thing, right? We need to be in Tyler Perry's ear, right? Because he has the capacity to make things happen. And so I think if he wasn't so jealous of Lee Daniels, right, maybe he may have made the decision, okay, I will executive produce For Colored Girls, right? But let me get a Black woman director, like the woman who first watched the script, right? Maybe, and hopefully we'll see that down the road. I mean, it remains to be seen, but I think it's very telling that as Tyler Perry is wrestling with this text, it's the moment that he finally publicly admits, well, guess what, right? I was sexually abused as a child and a teen, right? And so we're wondering, is this going to lead to some sort of process?
Can I just interject one thing? There is a proven audience for in pop culture, in Black consumption, for download stories.
Absolutely.
It's called Elin Harris. And so there is a mass consumption of that, the late Elin Harris. So I don't think that it's true necessarily that no space exists for the consumption of these stories. But Elin Harris is writing from the position of an out gay man telling his truth.
I got you.
Tyler Perry is not writing from that position of truth.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that's fine. That's fine, but Mark, understand the disparity here. You're allowing him that process in a very public way with our stories. And Tazaki got excoriated for Colored Girls. And so when Black women try to tell those stories about legitimate pain and trauma, she was put on trial for almost 30 years, crucified. So I'm not really quite sure why I'm supposed to have that patience with Tyler Perry coming to truth to his sexuality and his trauma and doing violence to my story while Tazaki tells her story and she gets slammed.
And I understand that, right? And we're on the same page with that, right? But I also think we're talking about the reality of dealing with images within the context of the marketplace, right? And I'm sure that, from a Hollywood standpoint, the reason why Tyler Perry makes this film, because if Tyler Perry makes this film, it makes some money. And in my mind, at some point there's a trade-off, right? I'm a big supporter and fan of Black independent film, right? A film like Night Catches Us.
Did anybody see that?
And if you see Night Catches Us, right? It's a film that was done by Black women in Philadelphia and about the aftermath of the Black Panther Party, right? A decade later, and dealing with the kind of messy circumstances once the revolution is over.
Did anybody see that?
And it's an incredible film because one of the things that the film does, and not a lot of critics have talked about it, one of the central characters, in fact, is a 10-year-old girl who's pulling and piecing everything together. And this is 1976. And when you realize what this little 10-year-old girl is, right? This is hip-hop a decade later, looking back, trying to pull together the pieces of what the civil rights and Black movement, right? And because of the difficulty in Hollywood, right, the film never gets a wide release, right? I think it may have been in 30 theaters at one time, but they came up with a strategy, right? They made the film available via iTunes, right? So you didn't have to go to the theater, you could down. And so we have all these kind of models of independent film, and for me, it's never an either or. It's in both ends, right? So how do we cultivate a space for everybody within the Black community to be able to tell their stories via film, but at the same time, how do we utilize, right, and even exploit, right, the celebrity and the power of Tyler Perry to do other kinds of labor within that context?
We're going to take some questions. You want to just go? You guys got questions, comments? This is the time. I think someone has a mic up there. I know we covered a lot of territory. It gets so heated. It's hard to go. There's so much territory to cover. Should I bring the mic to you?
Sure. I mean, that would be great.
If you can direct it to a specific person and make it a little easy.
Okay, my question is for John regarding the images, because I feel as an educator and an artist, probably breaking down stereotypes. So I was just wondering where we can access some of your images that you were talking about. This is a stereotype of the body and things of that nature.
I have some stuff on Blue Canvas, which is like an artist. Sorry. I have some work on Blue Canvas. I can send you some amazing stuff as well.
Let me just say one quick thing about the questions. Y'all been watching too many rappers. Because rappers never learn how to use microphones. So just pull the mic away a little bit and talk a little louder, right? And then we'll get a clearer sound.
Okay. Other next question. Yes.
My question is
There you go.
towards Joan. Right?
Yes.
Okay. I would like you to expound upon what you had discussed about coming from a gray area, so to speak, from being, not the traditional Jamaican, but not traditionally, experience the Black American experience, but to do it a separate area. And also that in regards to the truth that we were talking about, the integrity of representing a truth, even if it's not the most liked truth. I think part of my issue is not just relaying that truth, but there's so many truths. Why is there only one being projected? There's so many truths. Why is it just, why would the Columbia, there's so many, why would it just be about the drug? And that's where my issue comes in, not, is it a fact? Because there's a fact, there's some people who act like, what the media portrays as. That's where they pull their stereotype from. But why is that the only thing being portrayed? And I'd like some feedback on that.
Great questions. Joan, you want to take the first part or you want to?
Yeah, I guess I should clarify something. I definitely consider my experience to be a Black Caribbean American experience. So if someone were to ask me, am I Black American? The answer is yes. I've been an American citizen since I was 7 years old. My problem is that within the definition of a Black American experience, there's very, very little room for heterogeneity. So we don't understand that blackness is a variety of different ethnic identities. So you can be from Senegal and be Black American. You can be from Jamaica and be Black American. You can be from Guyana. You can be from Ghana. You can be from all the right, exactly. And have grown up in America. So this very American idea of the melting pot is somehow not applicable in our minds, in African American and in white American minds, of being legitimate in the Black experience. So it all gets melted down to this thing of African American, which we use interchangeably with Black. And I certainly have to acknowledge that growing up in America for most of my life has formed a great deal of how I think about the world. At the same time, growing up in a Jamaican household, eating Jamaican food, Jamaican culture, Jamaican music, owning homes and property in Jamaica, I go home every year and have since I was a little girl, and having family and speaking patois and eating, I have a whole other thing that goes on, is very much a part of who I am that cannot be defined simply by the narrative of an African American experience. It makes me illegible, and in a certain respect, it makes me invisible. Honestly, when we're talking about film, I have never, ever, ever seen a Black American film done, or any American film done, where the accent on the Jamaican actor or actress doesn't drive me to drink.
Robert Townsend. What's that movie? Robert Townsend and Denzel Washington.
Oh my God.
Mighty Quinn. Oh my God.
I fell out of love with Denzel at that moment, and that was a really hard thing to make happen. A really hard thing, actually quite, sadly enough, the best Jamaican accent I've ever seen was by Brad Pitt. In the one where he plays the devil. What is that movie? You know what I'm talking about. He plays the devil. So in that sense, I think that there has to be an opening for heterogeneity. And what we also have to understand is that my experience may not resonate as true with your experience. So there's a likelihood that you can make a film that might really make me bristle in certain ways. I'm really for getting into the down and dirty gray areas. And growing up as a girl, I call being Jamaican, as Mark likes to put it. Yes. And I literally do say Black Jamaican because there's this idea that all Jamaicans are Black, and we're not.
There are a couple of restaurants in New York on the side.
Right. We're a multiracial nation. Right? My son's grandmother is Chinese and speaks complete patois, and you cannot tell her that she's not Jamaican. So there's very little understanding of the island that I come from, except from images of what people think Bob Marley is about and dreadlocks and weed. At the same time, I can tell you a whole lot about African American history. And so we live in a country where I can go through the educational system and never learn anything about my own history, even if I'm taking classes in African American history.
Let's go.
And then even then, you want to talk to me about Marcus Garvey, but you don't really want to talk to me about how him being Jamaican and growing up in a completely complexion conscious, and she's sister in the back knows exactly what I'm talking about, where it's not about race, it's about your complexion and your class that dictates every single bit of your social and economic mobility. We never want to talk about how that fueled his passion for Black nationalism here, his return to Africa movement, and that he could not have been Marcus Garvey had he remained in Jamaica, because the Jamaican elite would never have allowed it. That's a different historical context. So I'm about difference has to go both ways. You have to acknowledge, I have to acknowledge that I'm different. You have to acknowledge that I'm different, but you also have to do a little bit of work to understand about who I am. And I feel like in America, we make no effort to learn about the other Black people who live here.
It was the second part of the question.
And we bring up because it's really difficult. You can't do a Myers Briggs test and everything, right? Walking down the street, right? Stereotypes are very useful because they're like shorthand for people, they're like roll-ups of people, right?
I heard somebody say that a couple of days ago. The power of stereotypes is that there's no ambiguity.
That's exactly right.
They're precise, right? are every
That's
time.
why they're not gonna change. You see, if you notice, when I see them, they sell us beer, they sell us like, cupcakes or whatever, they sell stuff to us now.
But let me say this, John, it is difficult, but it's also really not that difficult in some respects. There are two waves of very legitimate migration movements from the Caribbean here. So if you're teaching African American history and you're teaching the Harlem Renaissance, or you're teaching from 1900 to 1930, the deliberate omission of West Indian immigrations here is a deliberate omission. If you're teaching Immigration Act from 1965 and you're teaching the Hart-Celler Act, and you are not talking about the 600,000 West Indian people that live in Brooklyn, that is a deliberate omission in the part of how African American studies is constructed.
And you can't even talk hip hop history.
Right.
Right, because what hip hop becomes is a product in 1965. Why is Kool Herc in the Bronx in the first place?
Exactly. That's a valid point. Definitely. And I was thinking about like the nature of the stereotype. I mean, they're not really depictions of us. They're depictions of, the kind of heterogeneous ones that they're reflections of fears and lusts. They don't have really that much to do with us at all. They're abstractions, and to a certain degree, very bad abstractions of it.
But then to piggyback on that, when we're telling some true stories, like I think the second part of your question, let's say we look at My Handful of Grace, which is a film that I thought was very compelling, it's powerfully told. It tells a story, an angle of the drugstore in Colombia in a way that I hadn't seen it told before, right? From that, 18-year-old girl who's pregnant, who's trying to feed her family, who winds up getting caught up, right? We usually tend to hear about the Pablo Escobars, and we sort of glorify those characters, and we don't necessarily get the more, the casualties along the way. On the other hand, yeah, I want to hear about other parts of Colombia. I do. I want to hear about, and I also want to hear about our racial heterogeneity. Colombia is the country that has the biggest African community in Latin America, aside from Brazil. How many people know that? Yeah, 1 million. But it's not visible, right? Because when you look at Univision, and when you look at the movement, you see people who are as light skinned as I am, which is not represented. Sorry? Right, exactly. But so I think what we're trying to do is on the one hand push for true stories, and then also push for a variety of stories that is more representative of who we are. And I think at least my role in that, and I think as all of us are writers or creators, artists, what we try and do is tell our own stories in as compelling a way as we possibly can. And it's about also trying to get into positions where we can make some of those calls, which is incredibly difficult. And I will tell you that, for example, for me, if I wanted to go, I've had opportunities to do Spanish language television. I feel uncomfortable with certain aspects of the way that I will be portrayed in that context, and also the bills for the surgery that I will need to get in order to be able to read in Spanish language television. So ultimately, I haven't decided to make those moves, right? That's my choice. And I've tried instead to create a different type of body of work that doesn't involve the body. But you see what I'm saying a little bit? I think it's working on two tracks. It's making a criticism, it's understanding, on the one hand, the work itself, and then it's understanding the context in which it's made. If we don't get the financing, then it's hard for us to make that happen. So we need to be looking at it at all those different levels and produce messages. And I think we talked about before, real quickly, social media is allowing people to do things without some of those barriers to entry that we used to have.
We have 10 minutes left. So,
I just want to say a couple of real
okay.
things.
But if we can get one question, one answer, so we can kind of get as many as possible.
There's a great book by a scholar named Eric Locke called Love and Death. And it's a real good understanding about the white gaze, because part of what he's arguing is that, and very much as they're fearful and even hateful of blackness and black culture, it's this ongoing process of acknowledging love for it and then stealing it at the same time. And it's a really interesting process. So that when we talk about like the beginnings of the images of blackness in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we talk about blackface minstrelsy, and particularly folks like Burt Williams and George Walker. And blackface minstrelsy in the 1890s and the 1880s was the most popular form of American entertainment, right? This is before the film industry. And it was dominated by white actors who had shoe polishing. And Burt Williams becomes one of the first black crossover stars, in part by making the claim that he and George Walker were two real coons, right? The white folks who were doing it fake, they're real coons, right, who were dressed up in blackface. And I think the thing that's so critical about understanding Burt Williams' rise to fame, and then Lincoln Perry after him, Stephen Fetchner, you know, who was one of the most well-paid black Hollywood actors in the 20s and 30s. Burt Williams was born in the Caribbean, never lived in the American South, but performed some sort of caricature of what folks thought was an authentic black Southern experience, and it became the representative image and performance of blackness well into the 20th century. Lincoln Perry, who's second generation after Burt Williams, was born in the United States, but his parents were born in the Caribbean, right? And so it's interesting, at the same time that Caribbean identity and Caribbean presence is actually being denied in the context of African American culture, the folks who basically reproduced notions of authenticity around blackness were folks who came from the Caribbean. And so I think it's a really interesting, this idea that the notion that there's an authentic black image was right where it was bankrupt from the beginning. Right?
Okay, another question.
It's like a time, that's right.
We got about 7 minutes. One question, can we get 1 minute response to this one?
The phrase white gaze is a new term for it, but lately I've been watching old movies like Glory and getting back into these movies that were very emotionally charged. I always wondered, what would Martin Luther King do? And I always thought about it, how would he portray Tyler Perry? I guess it's like not a white gaze, but a Martin Luther King gaze. Because you know what? He was very instrumental to all us being in the same room right now. And yet, his statement and what he did, and what Tyler Perry did, turns my stomach to be that honest, you know? And I don't know how you feel.
Can I be honest and frank with you? Tyler Perry would have done special showings of his films in Martin Luther King's hall. And Martin Luther King would have loved those movies. Because while Martin Luther King represents a certain kind of figure to us in our imagination, and some of it is legitimate, Martin Luther King also was a chain smoker. Martin Luther King also very much loved women, so much so he was with 2 of them the night before he was murdered. The genius of Martin Luther King is that he was able to create a public image that was rooted in notions of black morality and the role that black morality played in transforming the nation. But Martin Luther King on the private side was a freak. And he would have loved Tyler Perry movies. And I actually think Malcolm X would have liked Tyler Perry movies, because one of the things folks miss about Malcolm is his sense of humor. And again, these are 2 men who, despite their public image, were very comfortable amongst everyday black folks who were doing everyday black things, right? And so I think King would have loved Tyler Perry.
This is really short, but he also would have worked with Tyler Perry because Martin Luther King was extremely strategic about working with Motown and rhythm and blues artists. He knew that the civil rights movement needed a soundtrack, so he worked very closely with people. And he would have worked with Tyler Perry to allow those images to influence his work, so that they had influence on his overall mission.
Next question.
So I work a lot with youth of color, and I in fact grew up being the only white girl in most of my classes. But this is all very academic conversation, and a lot of what I do is just on the ground activism. And when we talk about identity and truths, unfortunately to me, a lot of the kids I work with, Little League is their truth. That is what they see, and that's how they look and see themselves mirrored off in society, and how they are supposed to aspire to be like. So from all of your point of views, I don't know the answer, but whoever wants to respond, how do they recommend attacking that almost, and coming up from it of a place of truth and not of a place of defying someone's culture or telling them that what they know as truth right now is not the right truth, and how do you do that in an organic way?
I push back on the notion that Lil Wayne is their truth. I think Lil Wayne, I think mass-produced commercial hip-hop becomes the most projected image, but that's not necessarily a truth. Because I see, but I think that that's really important. Because I think what happens, particularly for young Black boys, there's no room made in their lives for expression of like, you know what, I'm not really like that rapper. I don't like to be hard. I don't particularly do drugs. My parents don't let me do certain things. And that you have to make a separation between the performance of Black masculinity and the truth of who those little boys
How
are.
do you break that space?
I think that you ask them really what their lives are like. You know, and what they like about Lil Wayne and what they don't, and like, are there things that they don't like about Lil Wayne? What are the ways, because I think that often as educators, as someone that's also been in the classroom as a teacher, we make assumptions about who our students are based on what they're saying, and it's often what they're not saying when we get to the truth of who they are.
That's good. This, I was gonna, Mark is gesturing to me is, there's a book written by a political scientist named Kathy Cohen called Democracy Remix, and the subtitle was called Black People in the Future of American Politics. And she did a survey called the Black Youth Project, and they surveyed young people 15 to 25 and asked them questions about, you know, what do they think about hip hop, what do they think about sex, what do they think about politics. And so the answers that they give are radically different than our assumptions that we make about young people. And there are a lot of questions about hip hop. Like one of the questions was, you know, should hip hop be more political? And a lot of people, overwhelmingly kids were saying yes. Are Black women represented in stereotypical demeaning ways, and should it stop? And overwhelmingly they said
60% of the males who answered the survey said.
yeah. So it's something that you should look at, blackyouthproject.org.
And let me say this about Wayne. Let me say this about Lil Wayne. If their notions of Lil Wayne have been mediated by mainstream culture, right? Because in some ways, Lil Wayne is more than what we get, right? In some ways, Lil Wayne is a complicated little point. And so I always tell folks who don't get Wayne, listen to the track Misunderstanding. And listen to him talk about the prison industrial complex, right? And Black political leaders not taking the time to understand the perspective, right? That's Lil Wayne, so they need to be introduced to that Lil Wayne if the only Lil Wayne they know is watching Lollipop on a music video or hearing him on a mixtape.